So good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with Dr. Antje Danielson. I've known Antje now for 5 years. It's amazing. Time flies when you're having fun. So Antje and I actually work together at the MIT Energy Initiative, and we've trying to do all these amazing things. But in addition to all the work that I'm familiar with, Antje has been doing a lot of other work, which is in addition to this mighty work and also things that she did before she came to the MIT Energy Initiative. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your career so far so we understand your journey, your leadership journey.
Yeah, as you can probably hear, I'm originally from Germany. In fact, I'm from Berlin in Germany, and you can imagine how taken I am right now with the news because of the whole Ukraine situation and refugees flooding into Poland and Germany and my hometown. I left Germany. I got all my degrees in Germany. I got my PhD at the Hahn-Meitner Institute in close to Berlin, in a research institute that is both sponsored by the state of Berlin as well as the federal government in Germany, and I was working very closely with the local university. My degree is from the Freie Universität, but my advisor was at the Hahn-Meitner Institute, and I was located there throughout my PhD. My PhD is in geochemistry. I have an undergrad degree in geology and a PhD in geochemistry. After I got my PhD, I departed very quickly from Germany, mostly because as a geoscientist in Germany in the 80s, there were no jobs, and especially not for women. You know, tough luck for me picking a man's profession. And I did my first postdoc in South Africa, mostly because I like to travel, but also South Africa has the rocks that I was studying during my PhD. And so I went to South Africa, was there for 2 years. And in South Africa, I met in person a faculty member from Harvard who I had admired very greatly. And I kind of read his book backwards and forwards and could recite it by heart. And so I met him there. He was on a field trip. I was his field assistant. And while we were in the field, he said, we had many really interesting discussions. And he said, well, why don't you come to Harvard as a postdoc? So I applied for a NATO fellowship and got it and became a postdoc at Harvard in 1991. And was at Harvard for a very long time. I left Harvard in 2005 and went through a number of career stages actually at Harvard. So I started off as a postdoc, and in 97, I had my first child. And that kind of precipitated a career change, a slight career change. As a geologist or geochemist, you travel a lot. And before I had children, I was constantly on some expedition or another. I was wondering if I could show a picture, but probably not. It shows me as a field geologist. I'm a total pacifist, but I have this big gun next to me because we were up in northern Canada in polar bear country, and I had to learn how to shoot. We never actually killed anything, but I had to learn how to shoot just in case. And so in 97, I had my first child, and little did I know that children don't like field work. And my son really did not like to travel. Initially I had this idea, I just do whatever I have done before, but that just doesn't work. I had just put in a grant application for some field work in Chile. And I didn't get the grant. And afterwards I was like, oh, very good that I didn't get this grant, because he would not have taken kindly to me putting him into a backpack and hiking him up the Andes. So my career change was to get into energy. And that was a logical consequence, energy and climate change, actually, because as a geochemist, I was studying climates in the past, but I was still studying climates. And so climate change was something that was sort of a pressing issue to me, having children now and thinking about the future more and so forth. And the next step to what can I do about climate change is let's look into energy. And I joined the, back then it was the Harvard University Committee on the Environment. It later became the Center for the Environment at Harvard University. And so I joined that as the manager of the energy project, which was a project to look into what can we do in the US in terms of changing our energy spectrum, our energy system to mitigate climate change. So I worked in that field until 2005. And then in 2005, my husband got a faculty position in Durham in the UK. And we packed up our house, rented it out, moved to the UK, stayed in the UK for 3 years. At Durham University, I was teaching, and I was also the deputy director of the Center for Research into Earth Energy Systems, where I started a carbon capture and sequestration group. That was another logical step from geochemistry to go into carbon capture and sequestration. And after those 3 years, my husband, we moved back because he got a faculty position at Brown University, and I became the director of the Institute of the Environment at Tufts University. I was 8 years at Tufts running the institute, and it was great fun. I loved Tufts. And then Bob Armstrong from MIT asked me if I would switch over to MIT. And I took a little bit of time thinking about this, but I had become a little bit bored with my job at Tufts. And so after a few weeks of thinking about it, I applied, and I'm now the director of education at the MIT Energy Initiative. And I've been in this position since 2016. A little bit of a detour from this academic and university career is that in 2000, I also started the car sharing company Zipcar. And that was sort of a spin-off from being the manager of the energy project at Harvard. Doing the energy project, we looked very closely into what can we do in the United States. And you probably all know this, academia moves very slowly. And I was getting very impatient with the talking about it, but not actually doing something about it. I'm a very impatient person. So I had come across car sharing, well, backing up a little bit, emissions, carbon emissions from mobility are the biggest source currently of carbon emissions in the US. So I had identified that as a high priority target for CO2 emissions reductions. And being as impatient as I was thinking, what can I do? Now, a lot of people say, well, how did you think of like an automobile company? Two reasons. First of all, there were some really successful models in Germany and in Switzerland, and they were at my fingertips to copy. But also, while I was an undergrad, I had earned my money by buying old cars and revamping them and putting them through the emissions test and so forth, and then selling them again for a good profit. Well, first, actually, before selling them, I usually took a trip in them, and then I would sell them. So I know a fair amount, or I knew a fair amount about cars back in the old days. These days, cars are so complicated. I have no idea what injection systems are and so forth. But when cars still had carburetors, I could keep up with that. So I put together my sort of capability of learning with some of the extracurricular stuff that I had done in my life before, and thought, yeah, I can do that. Oh, another piece was that at the time, I was on the Climate Action Committee in Cambridge, and I had met a lot of people and in the Climate Action Committee, and I was sort of sifting through the data point. I was like, yeah, this would totally work in Cambridge. So that the first idea was to do it in Cambridge, then broaden it out to Boston. And so I teamed up with my co-founder, Robin Chase, who is actually a Sloan School MBA. And together we started Zipcar. And Zipcar was the first really large car sharing company in the US. There was a smaller one in Portland, Oregon, which Zipcar eventually took over. And we went from Cambridge to Boston to Washington, DC, to New York, to a lot of college campuses, Chicago, you name it, Canada. You can find Zipcars now in the UK. So it's truly an international company. And I don't have anything to do with it anymore. It got sold to Avis at some point. But I was recently in Houston in the airport, and Houston, you could think of Houston as the wasteful city. And I'm sitting in the airport waiting for my shuttle. And there's a bus with this huge advertisement, Zipcar, and I was just like, this is me. And I didn't go around and tell people that, but I was very, very happy to see that. Anyway, how was that for an answer?
That's a great long answer, but I have one question I just thought of, because you said you went into Zipcar because you were impatient about emissions. So how do you think that Zipcar reduces emissions in terms of quantitative? Because it seems like I'm not really sure that logically I would have thought that would happen, because you're providing more cars more easily to more people.
Mm-hmm. There's research out there. Fortunately, there's research out there on that. And in the early stages of Zipcar, we did some more research on this. So you reduce emissions in two ways. Usually Zipcar members don't have cars, or they avoid having a second car. And because it is just a tad less convenient than having a car in your driveway, people actually drive less. So that can be shown. They only use the car when they need a car. You probably know, having a car, you probably know that it's so easy to fall into the habit of doing, I don't know, just running down the street and doing something, and you don't do that when you don't own a car, when you just have a Zipcar. Your use of a car is really much more planned. And the second way of reducing emissions are the embedded emissions. So on average, the normal car owner only drives a car, I think the number is 3% of the time, right? So your car stands in the street, in a parking lot, or in front of your house most of the time. Now, Zipcars are used up to 30%. So there is a much, much higher usage. So the number of cars produced is much lower.
Great. I'm glad I asked that question, because I had never really fully thought about the full answer, and I don't know if anybody else in the audience had. Anyway, so let's move on to leadership, since we want to talk about women's leadership and specifically. But do you think, what is your definition of leadership, and do you think it's different? Like, do you think great leadership is different for men and for women?
Yeah, I think so. I do think so. And I have to preface this by, for half of my life, I always thought men and women are the same. And it's just all how, it's all in the upbringing. But having had sons myself and being very careful of not raising them in a gender specific way, I do believe that there is an innate difference in behavior between women and men. But there's also a lot of cultural imprinting, of course. So I do believe that there are differences in leadership styles. I think that really, truly great leaders are not full of themselves. They are not self-centered, and they have the drive to be community oriented. So the really true leaders, I believe, are not looking out necessarily for their own benefit. There can be some benefit to them too, but I think they mostly do things because they want to help their community or the world. Let's see. So I think what follows from that, they're usually not self-promoters. They can become famous, but not necessarily because they're promoting themselves. They're promoting their cause. And if they're successful in addressing the cause, then they become famous too. But I think they're mostly promoting the cause. I think most great leaders are really proud, have pride in their work. They want to do good work for the greater good. And here now we come, so I think those two things are maybe gender neutral, or these three things are maybe gender neutral. But I do think that women have the tendency to be more horizontal leaders, whereas men have the tendency to be more hierarchical leaders. And I think another feature of a great leader is that they listen and synthesize the information that they hear, and process the information and synthesize it. Is that enough? Those are, of course, I have no data on.
Great.
Those are just
Yeah.
observations.
Yeah, I mean, everybody has their own definition of great leadership. And you might, one way I ask my students actually is, well, think of somebody that you think is a great leader. So if you go and look, let's say today who's alive, you look around, who would you say was that great leader that you think, okay, I give them an A for leadership? You don't have to answer that question. It's a good question, though. You don't have to answer it.
Well, I think some people are good leaders in certain situations. They might not always be good leaders.
That's
right?
true.
So if we look at the current situation with Ukraine, I think the French Prime Minister has sort of done a lot of the footwork, and of course Yeltsin, not Yeltsin. What's his last name? No, the Prime Minister of Ukraine.
Oh, Zelensky?
Zelensky. Yeah, there you go. Why did I say Yeltsin? I'm still back in the Soviet Union. Zelensky. I mean, he has crystallized as a great leader, right? Doing the right thing in the right situation. But that doesn't mean that he is a great leader in other situations, right? So I think leadership is very situational.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And the situation maybe creates the leader, because you know, in a crisis, you need a leader. Sometimes somebody steps up and says, okay, I'm going to help the situation. And sometimes they don't, right?
Yeah.
So in your particular leadership journey, I'm sure you faced some kinds of obstacles, and how did you overcome them?
Well, let me start with something an obstacle that I didn't have, I think.
Okay.
And that is, I didn't have any brothers. I grew up in a family with 3 girls. And my parents were academically oriented, but I never had to compete with, in my generation, there was a lot of the boys were expected to you know, go to school and achieve and become leaders, and the girls were expected to be pretty, you know. And so I never had that. I don't know if my dad expected me to be pretty, but it never came out. So I grew up with no doubt that I would go to college and that I would go be basically have a good academic foundation. But also I grew up with the notion that I could do whatever I wanted to do. And consequently, I picked a job that was a man's job, because I didn't even, back then, I didn't even think about gender differences. So I didn't have that obstacle. I think a lot of women have that obstacle, and they internalize it at a very early age, and I didn't have that. Let's see. But because of that, I had also this kind of what I would call useful, boisterous arrogance. So I remember when I was in college, we had a student protest, and we had just started a women's group because there were so few women in geology, and we felt very marginalized. And so we had started this women's group, and I felt like I was one of the founders, but I was much younger than most of the other women in that group. And but I was speaking up, and probably I was very loud, and I was probably annoying the other women a lot. And so one of the women took me aside and said, you know, it would be much easier to listen to you if you would just tone it down a little bit. And I think that was the first, or a step to self-awareness, and to starting to listen to others rather than sort of blurting out what I was thinking and just, you know, not really listening. So I think that was this useful arrogance was probably an obstacle to becoming someone who could be in a leadership position. But I had the good fortune to come across this woman who taught me something. Let's see, obstacles. After I got my PhD, as I said, I went to South Africa. And what I learned there was that as a single woman in a new country, it is very, very hard to make connections. And in South Africa, it was even harder than in the US. It was hard in the US too, but in South Africa, it was even harder because the society there is still pretty male dominated. So I wouldn't be invited to parties or to faculty. When a faculty member had a party at home, they didn't invite me. And so it was really hard for me to make a connection. And so there was a large degree of loneliness, therefore, for me in the first year. And what I learned there, I think, is that you can't be too picky with who you associate with. And then what I also learned was that most everyone has something really good to say. Again, this listening, you know, if you just listen to people, you can make really good friends, even if on first sight, you might not think this is someone that you would naturally associate with. Let me see. Integrating work and family was really hard as well. And I always felt guilty to a certain degree, because I always felt that I wasn't doing 100% of my job, and I wasn't 100% with the children. And I think in the end, I did an okay job with both the children and my job, but it was a struggle, I must say. And I don't think many men go through that struggle. Many years of very little sleep, and these like doubts and guilt attacks. And I also then started feeling like I was an imposter. I wasn't a real mother, and I wasn't really a real 100% colleague. So that was hard. I think that was maybe the hardest thing, actually.
That's really interesting, because you don't think of imposter syndrome as something that comes on at a certain stage in your life, but now the way you explained it, it makes really a lot of sense, because there were so many stresses and you couldn't do either of the job to your satisfaction. Then yeah, I mean, I went through the same thing, because of course I had all these children too, and I didn't get very much sleep. And I think that is definitely a challenge that affects you at so many levels, not getting enough sleep for many years.
Well, if you don't have enough sleep, your memory goes, and your retention is not 100%. You often don't speak as well, that those are all real physical effects of sleeplessness, I think.
Yeah, so sleeplessness could have been your greatest challenge.
Yeah, maybe.
Imagine, yes. So this is what's great about this part of life, where the kids are all gone and you can actually sleep when you want to.
It gets so much easier as you get older.
Yeah.
I think that's actually something that a lot of women need to know, that it gets easier as you get older, right?
It gets much better too, because you have the wisdom in addition to, the ability to sleep when you need to.
Right.
So you talked about all these great accomplishments. So if you look back on your life so far, what would you consider your greatest accomplishment, and why?
Oh, that's a hard one. I think there's probably more than one.
Okay.
There's of course the personal. I'm very proud of my children. I think I did okay with them. And if you think of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the bottom one is physical needs, and then I think comes safety and love and so forth. And I think I provided them with physical, with a place that they could identify with. So both of my children are still living in Cambridge, so they have roots, which is, I think, important. I also provided them with safety by providing them housing, working very hard to have a nice house and maintain it. Not always easy on a postdoc salary, and I tried to give them lots of love. So I think they had a good start in life. So that's I think my personal greatest achievement. And then professionally, that's a tough one. Probably Zipcar. But I'm also really proud of, and we already explored why, because there's carbon emissions. It's not a big impact, actually. These days now I'm thinking much bigger, but I think I'm also really proud of having been the director of the Institute of the Environment at Tufts. I worked with a lot of students there, and I was able to provide mentorship to those students. And a lot of them are in really good positions now, and they get back to me and tell me about it. So today, actually, we were interviewing some students from Northeastern for internships, and they have taken classes with one of my former students, which is really, really cool. And I'm also proud of creating the Center for Energy Education at the Energy Initiative at MIT, because I do see education as an accelerator of the energy transition. We do have the need for many, many, many people around the world globally who will be able to implement what's needed to achieve the energy transition and get a handle on climate change. And the more people we can give that knowledge to, the more learners we touch, the better I think the chance that we can do that.
Great. That's, yeah, you have a lot to be proud of, actually.
Well, well, I must say a lot of those things I didn't do by myself, right?
Yeah.
Zipcar I started was another woman. The Institute of the Environment, I had a great team, and now I have a great team too. I mean, you
Yeah.
and 7 other people, you know. So this is not, I think teamwork is one of the fundamental things of trying to achieve something.
So my last question before we go to the audience for questions is, what advice would you give to other women in STEM about their leadership journey and how they should navigate this tricky place?
Well, one is trust yourself and know that other women have been in the same situation, and that we all go through this to a certain degree, and that an imposter syndrome is a fictitious thing if you know your stuff. So the second one is know your stuff, right? Know what you're talking about. Do your data collection and your data analysis. Think it over. Listen to others and see what they think, and then compare that to what you have, the results that you got. And then I think, as I said, teamwork and listening, but also then hearing and incorporating what you hear into your work. I think that's important.
Okay.
But knowing your stuff, that's why you are at MIT, right? That's what you learn there. You know your stuff.
Know your stuff and know yourself too.
Yes, you. Since I have not been a student at MIT, my husband was a grad student at MIT, and I've seen him go through this, and it was not easy. In fact, we were graduate resident tutors there for 7 years, and I've seen a lot of students struggle through undergrad as well. Yeah.
I did too. In fact, that's why I wouldn't let any of my children go to MIT for undergrad, because I was a teaching assistant and I had undergrads in my class, and I was like, oh, this is too tough. I don't know if it's improved. It's back, that was a long time ago when I was a TA.
Well, as a graduate resident tutor, you get training every summer. And a lot of the training is how do you deal with psychological breakdowns?
Yeah.
And I mean, the bottom line is, do not try to treat it yourself. Give the students the resources. But it's quite frightening, actually, what the stress is that's on the students.
It's incredible stress. Okay, so
who do I tell?
So I'm going to stop the recording and open it up to the audience.